Following its independence in 1947, India established a full-fledged democracy based on equal rights. When the Bharatiya Janata Party, led by Prime Minister Modi, assumed power, the dominance of Hindu nationalism since then has brought about disquieting shifts that have undermined the functioning of democracy, where something like 90% of the media sounds like propaganda. No single culture or language or identity is central to its identity or unity. Now, the crucial turning point in the growth of majoritarian politics was, of course, the mass mobilization to build a Ram temple where the Babri Masjid once stood in the city of Ayodhya, highlight India's slide into authoritarianism and majoritarianism, which are mutually intertwined and facilitating processes.
ഞാൻ രണ്ട് വാക്കേ പറയുള്ളൂ. Zoya മാമിനെ പറ്റി ജാസ്തി പറയുന്നില്ല because you can access all information on her from the net. So that would be redundant. I hope you understand that. November 12-ന് ഡിപ്പാർട്ട്മെൻറ്റ് ഓഫ് പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ സയൻസ് ആൻഡ് പബ്ലിക് പോളിസി അത് ഗുഡ്ഗാവ് യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റിയിൽ ഇവരുടെ ഒരു പ്രഭാഷണം വെച്ചിരുന്നു. പലസ്തീൻ ആയിരുന്നു വിഷയം. On 10th, I believe they called it off. I don't know for whatever reason. So the reason, I will leave it to your imagination. The only other point I would like to make is her very first sentence in a book which I strongly recommend everybody should read, Democracy on Trial. That's a sentence that reminds me of Charles Dickens' opening, A Tale of Two Cities. It's as memorable as that. So with that, ma'am, I'll cede the space and the stage to you. Thank you.
Friends and colleagues, I'd like to thank the speaker of the KeralaNiyamasabha, Mr. A.N. Shamsher, and the Cultural Committee of the KeralaLegislature International Book Festival for inviting me to speak at this wonderful event, and of course for the opportunity to visit the beautiful and lovely state of Kerala. It's indeed a privilege to speak at this unique literary book event organized by the Kerala Legislature. There's so many book events now that happen, but I think this one is truly unique and different precisely because it is organized by the Legislative Assembly. Now, the title of my talk, which is really based on my book, is Democracy on Trial. And the worrisome decline of India's democracy began in 2014 when the Bharatiya Janata Party, led by Prime Minister Modi, assumed power. The dominance of Hindu nationalism since then has brought about disquieting shifts that have undermined the functioning of democracy, above all, the guarantee of civil and equal rights for all citizens. The proximate explanation for this is the election of a majoritarian government, and under the leadership of the Prime Minister, the BJP was the first party to win a parliamentary majority since 1984, ending a quarter century of national coalition governments at the center. Now, that victory set into motion a new historical process which has shifted Indian politics to the right, one might even say to the far right. This has transformed the state to one where majoritarianism dominates. Its stated ideology is to make Hindus a self-conscious political force and consolidate Hindu cultural and political power. This involves replacing the political discourse in a Hindu idiom in a country where there is a multiplicity of identities and cultures. Following its independence in 1947, India established a full-fledged democracy based on equal rights. this was a bold experiment, perhaps the most significant in a post-colonial society of multiple faiths, languages, and regional cultures. It was a great success story of the post-war era. Democracy in our country has not only survived, it has been institutionalized, barring the period of the emergency, which of course marked a repudiation of democratic processes. Historically, and that's the point, the key point, historically, India's democracy has worked well precisely because no single culture or language or identity is central to its identity or unity. And India's stunning diversity has been supported since independence by a political structure that emphasizes equal rights. However, and very sadly, India has changed politically, socially, and economically. Fortunately, not everywhere, but in large parts of the country, it has changed. And the very idea of democracy based on equal rights has come under the pressure of majoritarian politics. Now, three shifts exemplified in the consolidation of a majoritarian brand of politics, concentration of power in the hands of the executive, and a clampdown on dissent highlight India's slide into authoritarianism and majoritarianism, which are mutually intertwined and facilitating processes. Now, each of these shifts, significant in their own right, but taken together, they constitute a major threat to democracy. Majoritarianism involves a massive project of cultural change, rewriting history, reorienting education, renaming public spaces, marking more sharply the boundaries between Muslim and Hindu. Now, it's important to keep this political background in mind because the principal explanation for democratic decline in the last decade has to do with the domination of this ideology. That is to say, the clampdown on dissent is justified in the name of nationalism, with any criticism of the dominant ideology condemned as anti-national, which justifies their mistreatment. Now, the crucial turning point in the growth of majoritarian politics was, of course, the mass mobilization to build a Ram temple where the Babri Masjid once stood in the city of Ayodhya. Now, this political project would not have advanced as it has in the last 30 years, that is to say, the Hindutva project, without the ground prepared by the Ayodhya movement. And thus began an era of majoritarian politics that has polarized Indian society ever since. Now, the re-election in 2019 of this government emboldened it to further its long-standing agenda to transform India's secular constitutional democracy into a de facto Hindu nation, despite the fact that 200 million of its citizens are Muslim. Since 2019, the government has overseen multiple changes in the policy and political realm. Things moved fast as the regime moved swiftly after its re-election in 2019 to reshape the Indian Republic. And a series of laws were passed in quick succession. The most important, or the striking, was, of course, the scrapping of Jammu and Kashmir's autonomy and its statehood, the Citizenship Amendment Act, all providing an expedited pathway to citizenship for undocumented migrants from our three neighboring countries. And of course, the construction of the Ram Temple and its inauguration last year on 22nd January. Now, all of these policies, it's important to note, faced popular opposition, but that opposition was steamrolled. The only exception were the scrapping of the controversial farm laws but it took lives of almost 700 farmers and a potential electoral setback for the ruling party to compel the withdrawal of these laws. Now, right-wing regimes led by authoritarian leaders tend to centralize power in themselves, thereby weakening institutions. The systematic attempt to give the executive an upper hand in most matters has been achieved by the regime's ability to control institutions, either by appointing people who are ideologically aligned to it or are favorably inclined towards it. The weakening of institutions then, in a way, replicates patterns beheld under Congress rule as well. But, and this is an important point, but there is a strong component that differentiates the current system and its authoritarianism, and that is the ideological impulse driven by ethnic nationalism or Hindu nationalism. Now, this extent of political centralization that has occurred has not really occurred when there's no formal declaration of the emergency. And two critical decisions, which I think are important to note, illustrate this, and that is the demonetization in 2016 and the national lockdown after the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. I think the manner in which these decisions were taken without any consultation with relevant institutions, I think illustrates the pitfalls of centralization, because both decisions, we know, were taken by the Prime Minister himself and his advisors, and not even his own cabinet. Now, this stands in stark contrast to the emergency, in the sense that Indira Gandhi's authoritarianism was essentially opportunistic, using legal and regulatory action to make life inconvenient for those that crossed its path, whereas the BJP's operations are organized around an ideological commitment to the idea of a Hindu nation and the eagerness to establish a majoritarian state. And the result of this is a concerted attempt to stamp out dissent in pursuit of political control and ideological dominance. Now, this extreme concentration of executive power is paralleled by a concentration of economic power, as the government bestows tax breaks and policy favors on big business and monopoly capital, which in turn reciprocates by extending huge financial support to the party. Now, the most important element of the political crisis or democratic crisis is the crackdown on free expression, dissent, and protest. And since 2014, civil liberties have been hugely curtailed, to some extent legally, and to a significant extent practically. And authorities have used laws against terrorism and sedition to harass, scare, and even jail scholars, academics, journalists, and activists deemed too critical of the ruling party. And substantial resources have been devoted to stopping public protests which are simply not allowed. Of course, protests in favor of the government or demanding something from the government by those who support it are allowed. But any anti-government protest is simply not allowed. And one example of such restrictions is the use of Section 144 of the Criminal Procedure Code, which can remain in force for months on end. It has been used to prohibit large gatherings and impose restrictions on the movement of people in and around protest sites. Education, which has been the most profoundly affected by this regime, and there is really a crisis of education in India, in education, their priorities are mostly ideological. History textbooks have been rewritten to include Hindu nationalist figures, praise the government's own initiatives, and minimize contributions of Muslims in particular. Institutional attack has been most starkly experienced in universities, and there's been a massive decline in academic freedom, simply because these are places that encourage independent thinking and therefore the home of a lot of dissent. I think this is not surprising because as an essentially anti-intellectual government, this regime dislikes universities and thinking and criticism that should take place and that does take place in universities, and they simply do not like people who question or think or criticize. Now, rights are another critical component of a functioning democracy, but this regime is much more, it has been very concerned that there was too much emphasis on rights in the past, and particularly during the United Progressive Alliance government, and not enough on duties, even though the Constitution doesn't place them on an equal footing, that is, rights and duties. But you might remember that the Prime Minister called for a paradigm shift from rights to duties, and he emphasized the need to prioritize duties over rights, drawing on India's ancient past to justify the primacy of duties. But this shift from rights to duties, I think, reveals a rightward shift in economic policy and welfare policy as well. But I think what has been most affected by the regime, apart from academic freedom, which I mentioned, and rights, is, of course, that the space for and recognition of opposition as a vital part of democracy has been considerably reduced. All forms of opposition are demonized and restricted by various means. By equating government criticism with disloyalty to the nation, the government is diminishing the very idea that opposition is legitimate. And indeed, they have used every available legal and political tool to undermine it. I think this was clear. This was clear from their early position, which was the drive to establish what they called a Congress Mukt Bharat, or a Congress-free political landscape in the country. This has now, of course, been extended to one of establishing an opposition-free political space. And this approach reached its apogee in the mass suspension of MPs from Parliament, you would remember, in the winter session of 2023 for alleged unruly behavior. And they were basically asking for a discussion on the security lapse that had taken place in Parliament in the winter session of 2023. But I think this unprecedented number of suspensions is important because it represents a clear move towards an unconstitutional concentration of power and getting away with whatever they want to do. Now, this regime then has proceeded as far as it has through the control of the media network and the information order. I think the BJP and its corporate allies gradually seized control of the mainstream media, in particular the television media, but also sections of the print media. The whole information order, which includes mass media and social media, and even media in vernacular languages such as Hindi. I cannot say the same about other regional languages because I'm not familiar with that, but certainly it would include Hindi, is tightly controlled, even more tightly controlled than media, for example, in English. Now, the national TV channels follow the government agenda and does not cover the opposition parties adequately. Mainstream media, especially broadcast media, has been enlisted in an as an image-building machine that glorifies the government, and it has, in the process, abdicated its responsibility of holding power to account. It has got to a point where something like 90% of the media sounds like propaganda. Now, even though this regime is more powerful than most previous ones, it seems to be more intolerant of criticism and dissent than previous ones. And the regime, and why is this so? And I think there's an interesting point here, and that is the regime senses that despite the popular mandate in 2 consecutive elections, and even in the third one, they did win 240 seats, much short of the 400 that they had loudly proclaimed, but nonetheless, they are in power for a third time. But despite being in power for a third time, I think the regime senses that despite winning power in consecutive elections, its thought control is not complete. The result then is to control every person who thinks. Now, from a macro perspective then, in the light of what I've just said, 2 important factors have further reduced the space for dissent and free speech. The political balance of power and the ideological and policy moorings of the ruling party. Politically, the new hegemony of the right is attempting to replace a left-leaning narrative with Hindutva, not just to demonize its enemies, but to mobilize Hindus politically. This ideological shift to the right is contrary to the manner in which India was conceived and shaped by its founders. This project is deeply conservative in its ethos, yet, and that's the paradox, and yet seemingly liberal in terms of the faith it has placed on the economic forces of the market and development of vikas as the promise, but the promises of vikas or development remain fulfilled. But the important point is the extraordinary faith in the economic forces of the market. So the current regime then, in the circumstances, because its development promises remain unfulfilled, relies on communal appeals to the Hindu majority to promote a deeply divisive agenda identifying the other, principally Muslims. Its efforts to reconceptualize the Hindu majority as the country's natural citizens has continued unabated. And despite the opposition, as we know, the Ministry of Home Affairs has laid out the rules for implementing the CAA. Now, so secondly, I think, and this is again important, India's growth is heavily weighted towards the wealthy, who have become exponentially richer in the last decade. Driving these trends in inequality is a policy regime that palpably favors monopoly capitalists, especially some relatively new business houses that constitute the cronies of this government and that are very close to this government. This has resulted in the extraordinary concentration of wealth in the coffers of a few corporate actors and at the same time, an extraordinary number of people are out of work, unemployed. One estimate puts unemployment, as we know, at about 40%. Another one, in fact, now puts it at 45%. And what is more, on several social indicators, notwithstanding all this hype about India's emergence on the world stage and Vishwaguru and so on and so forth, and that we'll soon be we are the 5th largest economy, and we'll soon be the third largest economy in the world. The fact is that on several key social indicators, India is falling behind its neighbors, such as Bangladesh and Nepal, although we do not know the state of Bangladesh now because Bangladesh is in a turmoil, so we don't know how long the social development that has taken place in Bangladesh over the last 30 years or so will be sustained. So the result is that today India is one of the, or second most unequal country in the world. Some say it is perhaps the most unequal country in the world. But the regime is not losing any sleep over inequality. In fact, one can find barely any mention of inequality or unemployment in the speeches of the Prime Minister and other top party leaders. Overall, then, India has become more communal, more authoritarian, and more unequal. But there is resistance to these changes ushered in by the Hindu right. There are important pockets of resistance that have emerged, even if scattered through the country in the shape of movements, protests, and electoral alliances, and in the shape of diversity of arguments, languages, and belief systems of the people. And I think the civil society in large parts of the country has been fairly vocal in its dissent and making their demands for greater equality. For example, the opposition against the Citizenship Amendment Act was quite remarkable. And as also, and even more, in fact, remarkable is the opposition to farm laws. Now, the BJP's, as a result of this, I think, of this opposition, scattered though it is, the BJP's expansionist ambitions and its expansionist right seem to have stumbled in the 2024 Lok Sabha polls. This election, that is the election in May-June, was April, May, June, the longest and the hottest election in our electoral history, was fought against the backdrop of growing Hindu nationalism and deepening authoritarianism and the ruling party's stranglehold over money, media, and capture or subversion of nearly every institution in India. What is more, the bank accounts of the principal opposition party, the Congress, were frozen, as you would remember, on the eve of the elections. And two important opposition leaders were sent to jail. Now, if elections were not held under these circumstances, the results would have been very different. They were good, but they would have been even gooder, so to speak. It still the BJP, despite all this, fell short of an absolute majority, even though it had done everything it could to bend the system in its favor. The most striking loss, and that's a matter of great satisfaction to someone like me, was the most striking loss was in Uttar Pradesh, where the BJP and its allies got fewer seats than the opposition. And Faizabad, Ayodhya, from where I come, I'm really exactly from there, Faizabad, Ayodhya, where the Ram temple is located, rejected the BJP despite the inauguration of the grand Ram temple. And what is more, the BJP candidate was defeated in a non-reserved constituency, we must remember, by a Dalit candidate. Now that obviously caused much discomfiture in the saffron camp. Now these results show the limits of the right or the Hindu right's dominance. And I think, interestingly, the ruling party's behavior in parliament and outside since 2024 verdict in June, and the aggression shown by it underlines its irritation with the enhanced numbers of the opposition, which is 234. Very, very significant. This is hardly surprising, as in the BJP's imagination of dominance, intolerance, and impatience with those who disagree is inherent. Now, in conclusion, then, the 2024 election results and their aftermath hint at a crack in the populist facade and a widening discontent with BJP's economic and political record and performance. The high levels of discontent reflected in the fact that the opposition alliance, the India Alliance, won 234 seats. indicates the limits of right-wing dominance, and the political rebuff is an indication of the space for a political constellation against it. It shows that the triumph of the right in India, as indeed I would say in several other countries, if we look at the election results in Sri Lanka, in the United Kingdom, and in France, along with the results in India, I think what it indicates is that the triumph of the far right is not cast in stone. It can be challenged, if not defeated, if opposition forces unite in coalitions to counter the Hindu supremacist agenda. However, merely forging a pre-election coalition will not be enough. India needs opposition unity based on an alternative, progressive politics that can foster a counter-hegemony of its own against the narrowness of ethnic nationalism and the compulsive resort to high-handed tactics to trample opposition and dissent. The hegemony that the right has used to build has built using idioms, symbols, and images of regressive nationalism can be challenged by a counter-hegemony of progressive, inclusive nationalism, and above all, pluralism. Thank you very much.
ഇരങ്ങുന്നു മനമുയർന്നു തമസകറ്റുന്ന നറുവേ